This evening for the first program of our 2019-2020 year. The mission of World Wisdoms is to offer opportunities for Northern Colorado communities to individually and to collectively ponder the challenges of our time in the context of spiritual traditions and beliefs. We offer events such as this afternoon, which might help us reach a deeper understanding of the diverse perspectives of our neighbors and friends. We have 3 new board members this year. Could you please stand? So, Kathleen Willard, David Cloyd is at the camera there, and Jesse Ponsalillo is not here tonight, okay? And then would the rest of the board stand? And if you have questions, please please ask a returning board member, and definitely introduce yourself to the new board members. So we're interested in your thoughts and your ideas about World Wisdoms. Our support coordinator is Abby Bain, and she is over here, raise your hand, and she can also answer questions for you as well. Thank you. We continue our 2-year program called Shared Stories of Spiritual Journey. And I guess I should ask people to silence their phones too. So. Yeah, it might be. We have to turn the sound out, yeah. That's always what happens when the announcer says, please silence your phone. Our program theme is a 2-year theme, and so it spotlights speakers who share stories and experiences and backgrounds of their spiritual traditions and explorations. So in the fall of 2018, last year, we focused on experiences and pilgrimages and destinations of American Indian, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, and Islamic traditions. And then in the spring, we explored the moral growth of the care for the individual in Jewish and Christian contexts, and the ethical growth toward the care of the earth in humanist and Buddhist traditions. So our videos are on our website, so check those out, including the first Vianne's Memorial Lecture that was given by Winifred Sullivan last year. And this fall, we'll host 2 programs, this one and one in November, and the theme is Conversations with the Secular. Tonight, this afternoon, the first program will feature a panel discussion among chaplains of various institutions across our region, sharing insights about speaking about spiritual matters in secular settings, like hospitals and universities. And the second event will feature a conversation on the holy in everyday life with Lori Goodrum, one of our board members and a noted spiritual director, and Trinity Wilburn, who is the founder and creative director of Architect. In spring, we turn our attention to the question of where do you find awe and wonder? And the first spring session will explore stories of awe and wonder drawn from science, nature, spirituality, and poetry. And the second spring session will be on whether the experience of awe in nature can motivate environmental activism. So there are brochures describing these programs, and they're on our information table behind us, and so please take one. It's also on the website. I want to thank all of you that you have offered your time, your financial contributions, and your heart to the work of World Wisdoms Project. And I especially want to recognize those who contributed to our spring fundraising campaign. We are an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we're reliant on your contributions to sustain and grow our programs and outreach. We do not want finances to deter anyone from coming to our events, so you may have noticed that we don't charge a fee. However, free will donations of any time are welcome and will be received with gratitude at the welcome table. We'll continue to be in contact with you this year about our finances. And if you have questions about our finances or wanting to donate, Bill Neeland and Marianne Baer. Bill Neeland is the incoming president of World Wisdoms, and Marianne is a board member. They'll be at the information table in the back here. And if you're new to World Wisdoms, I invite you to visit our updated website at worldwisdomsproject.org, and there's an S because in wisdoms, because there are many wisdom traditions in the world. And also I'd like to acknowledge our sponsor, Plymouth Congregational Church tonight. A little housekeeping, so the exits are obviously where you came in the back here, and then to the front, out that direction. Bathrooms are down this hall. There's a sign up above, and restrooms are also down that hall, and there's a sign right as you go down the hall there. And the refreshments here and snacks are available, so please take advantage of them anytime during the program that you would like. And now what I'd like to do, we traditionally have a moment of silence before we start our program to also bring us sort of to where we are here so we can listen to the speakers, and also to give our kind thoughts to the speakers that they may be their best tonight. So if we could have just a minute of silence, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn the program over to Bruce Ronda, who is the chair of the Program Committee for World Wisdom, as well as a board member.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. And thank you all very much for coming. Can you hear me? Very good. Our format this afternoon is a bit different from our format in previous events, if you've been to those. I'm going to begin with a few words of introduction. I'll introduce the speakers, the panelists. I'm going to ask them each to speak for about 8 minutes. I've asked them to think about their approach to chaplaincy that they're currently doing, chaplaincy that they may soon become involved in. And then what I'm going to encourage is that the panelists and I engage in a conversation among ourselves, kind of a question and answer that's in miniature up here. Certainly things will arise in the observations that they make that will prompt us, that will stimulate us, and to ask some more questions. So I'm hoping that that will go to nearly 3 o'clock. And then we're going to pause for about 5 or 6 minutes and invite you to get more refreshments and find the restroom and come back, because what we'd like to do then is to engage in a real talk back, real conversation with you. So if you have questions, observations, stories of your own about engagement with chaplains, that would be the time to share. So we're hoping to be done a little bit before 4. It just depends on what all we have to say. So let me begin by introducing our panelists. Some are familiar to you, some not so. So Maria Cox, a familiar figure to many of us. For the last 15 years or so, Maria has served as a chaplain at Poudre Hospital, McClean Medical Center, and Pathways Hospice. She says, she writes, that she works at the intersection of spirituality and suffering, assisting patients, family, and staff in finding spiritual resources and meaning as they navigate change. Atlas Tanudjaja is next in line here. Atlas just finished a master's in divinity at Naropa in the history of religion and work in study of religion. She is a 2019 graduate in the clinical pastoral education program that's co-sponsored here in Fort Collins with Colorado State, UC Health, and Columbine Health. Atlas is currently teaching at CSU courses in the student diversity program, especially the Asian Pacific student group. And Atlas is teaching a course in leadership also at Colorado State. And finally, an avid runner and cyclist, as he likes to say, Joseph Moore has served Presbyterian churches in Texas and Colorado. He has recently been asked to work with Fort Collins Police Services in forming a chaplaincy for that organization here. So please join me in welcoming these panelists. So one of the most persistent themes, I think, in our life today, our collective life, is how divided we are. It seems like in kind of every register of social life, we feel ourselves separated from one another, certainly by race, by ethnicity, by gender, by education, by our social and religious commitments, by our faith communities. This is everywhere in the news, and it certainly is forming the substrate of our political turmoil today, is how divided we are. There is one sense, however, in which we, whether we like it or not, live together. And that is that most of us engage, in one way or another, institutions that we might call secular, that don't have an allegiance or anymore an identity with religious organizations. In the past, in this country and in Europe, services like hospitals, nursing care, service to the elderly were all provided by religious organizations. But in our time, these have largely been taken over by the state, by secular organizations. In one way, this is good news, because the organizations claim to be, and sometimes are, often not, sometimes are, even-handed. But our experience, I think, is sometimes different. As we engage these institutions, universities, public schools, hospitals, the military, public safety, and for many in this room, Social Security and Medicare, Plan A, B, C, D, F. Is there not a C? I can't. We have a somewhat different experience. We engage these, we encounter these institutions with fear, with anxiety, with concern, with discomfort, and sometimes with the sense that we're not being treated fairly. This is equally true, I think, of those of us who engage those institutions. I think that is virtually everyone in this room, and also by the staff who staff them. They often feel also alienated from or discomfort with the institutions that they serve. So in the middle of all of that, we might ask the question, where is the life of the Spirit? Where are spiritual concerns cared for in those institutions, if at all? Where might we feel that aspect of our lives addressed in what is often extremely impersonal circumstances? I can think of no other group of people who address that very question of the life of the Spirit, or as Joseph said recently, the care of the soul, than chaplains. These are the people, I think, who in many ways are the front line of engaging the whole self in institutions that sometimes just care for part of us. So I've asked these three folks to share with us at the beginning some reflections about how they do chaplaincy, their approach, their method. I've also really asked them to tell a story or two, if possible, all of this in 8 minutes, about their experiences as chaplains. And of course, if those stories don't emerge in the 8 minutes, there'll be time afterwards for them to help. So that's our agenda in the first part of our program, to hear these people reflect for us their life in the chaplaincy, which is really a kind of life in the trenches, it seems to me. So without further ado,
Thank you, Bruce. I want to pull a thread that you just left hanging out for me that's fascinating in that even the name of the talk or the theme is spiritual in the secular. So we've already got a binary dual system going on. And I would like us, because I can't help myself, to do a merge. And, you know, as Richard Rohr or many of our teachers would say, everything belongs. So I don't see myself as a spiritual presence in a secular setting as much as engaging the soul of the organization that already exists. So I'm loving that you set that up for me. It was kind of like a good joke where someone sets you up. And David White's work with the soul of organizations and people like this are really able to identify for us and speak about that reality. So that's how I see what the three of us are up to. I'm going to do some really basic definitions as far as my understanding of chaplaincy that I think will dispel some of the myths. Whenever I speak about chaplaincy in public, these same questions come up, so I'm going to take care of them. And maybe this group is so evolved that you don't even have these questions. But chaplaincy is different from traditional religious or spiritual practice. So we could put our rabbis and our monks and our nuns, I was going to say nuns, and imams and every kind of religious leader we can think of. And chaplains might come from that group. But what ends up with us is, rather than promoting and teaching a specific practice or way, we don't preach and teach. So what we do is we meet up with the person, the family, the staff person, and go on their journey. So we don't ask people to come into our boat or our way. We ask people if they would like us to sit with them in their way and find their journey and their spiritual resources and their timing on healing. Because I have a lot of ideas about how you could certainly do better, but that doesn't matter when I'm a chaplain. So what do you think? Okay. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. So people say, well, oh my God, you're Roman Catholic. How could you possibly go into someone's room who's Jewish? Well, I get to do that as the chaplain if they invite me, number one, if they ordain me in that moment. And number two, we're going to go on their journey, which might be about their Jewish experience, but it might be about 100 other things too, like their dog, or their new diagnosis, or their neighborhood, or their yoga practice, etc., etc., etc. So everything belongs. I like the definition of spirituality because people get stuck on religion, spirituality, what is it? I don't have one, maybe you do, but I don't. And I like the Consensus Project definition. Spirituality is the aspect of humanity that refers to the way individuals seek and express meaning and purpose, and the way they experience their connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or sacred. So how do people articulate their connection within, without, across all genres of experience? That is a definition of spirituality that I really like. So spiritual care is joining in that pursuit, and often it's in moments of suffering when chaplains get to come. And in moments of suffering, sometimes the structures that have held people pretty securely, their spiritual and religious beliefs and practices, Some of them are working great and some of them don't work at all. And we get to sit at that intersection and hold the questions. Sweet example, 32-year-old woman. I always thought if I was a good person, I attended my faith community, I donated my money and my time, only good things would happen to me. And now I have breast cancer and 4 small children. So that system she was in, which is pretty primitive in some ways, was kind of a Santa Claus religion, and that broke down. And so she wanted to rebuild because she felt so connected to the divine. She wanted to rebuild a new structure that would be perhaps more mature and more durable and more expansive. And chaplains get to be a part of that. Shall I give an example, or am I out of minutes? Okay. So I had a wonderful Hindu family visiting from India, and they were in the ICU, and the kids live in Fort Collins, but the parents were the visitors. And this gentleman was very ill. We were about to code him, and code blue was going to be called. His heart was looking like it was going to stop. And everyone was pretty pessimistic that we would be successful. So we gathered the family, and in this instance, the family was invited into the room. And I asked the family, what would be most important for us to be doing as far as your tradition would teach us? And one of the daughters grabbed my phone and went to YouTube and called up some chants, some music, some prayer. And the patient's wife looked at me and said, "Can you bring the holy water?" Okay, well, I'm Catholic. I've got holy water from St. Joe's. You know, you can go in there with a container and they got like a keg of holy water. So I've got holy water. So I called another chaplain in the building. I said, "Can you grab the holy water and bring it up?" I said, "What are we going to do?" She said, "I've been in situations in hospitals where you chaplains who might be Christian have holy water, and we want to use your holy water, and we want you to pray over our person." And I said, "Then that is definitely what we're doing." Now, I would never have said, "How about some holy water?" So there's the example of going in your boat, not my boat. And so we got the YouTube chants being sung, and I said to the doc, "I'm going to squat down right at the head of the bed. Is that okay?" Because a lot of action is going on. And I'm going to put this over his ear so he can hear it. And the doc said, "Do whatever you need to do." And then I had the wife come with me, and I would say to her, "What are some of the prayers that we should say with the holy water?" She said, "You just do your prayers and then I'll do some of mine." I was like, okay. So we had this, because of my tradition, I kind of like that anointing of the eyes and the mouth and the hands and the feet, you know, that we do at the end of life to bless the journey, everything that was seen, everything that was said, everything that was touched in life. And then she followed me and did her prayers. And indeed, the gentleman died. So the family was able to say he got exactly what he needed and what we wanted at the end of life from this, you know, white person who's got a Christian background. But that story to me is a great chaplain story because I got to go on their journey.
Can everyone hear me? Okay.
A little
A
louder.
little louder?
Yeah,
there.
do the next.
Yeah, we're
talking
I think
about-
we're supposed to talk like this. Give me a hand signal if you can't hear me. So my approach to chaplaincy. It's hard to top yours.
We can go
I
together.
know. I'm just noticing the difference in experiences and all the things involved in our path. So for me, it started with the need to heal and understanding how I can use my time and my life here and focus as much as possible on healing. So I started in business. I was Republican, libertarian, and was all about the fiscal policy, and that has changed since then, because when I learned that even though I do care a lot and I have a lot of passion, it is not important if I don't understand myself and what makes me who I am. Because there's a lot of things that happens inside of us, and if we don't work on to understand that, it becomes very challenging. So it started from that place, and also coming from a Christian background, being very faithful and all these things, and seeing all these pain and suffering, and finding myself disappointed over and over again, and wanting to do something about it. So, therapy saved my life. I think everyone should go to therapy because it's just, wow. Yeah, and I learned so that's where I started learning about mindfulness. And I learned about the importance of contemplative practice. And in Christianity, growing up Christian, I didn't learn much about it. We had prayers and we go to church, but I didn't know how to relate to myself and, find the God in myself kind of way. So it started from that place and wanting to understand more of that. And I got into EMT and I learned about death. I think growing up in the city, you don't get exposed to death that much, and you don't have opportunities to talk about death that much, especially at school, especially with your parents. So working that job showed me the importance of, if I don't understand my relationship to death, I'm not going to understand my relationship to my life and know how to live my life in a way that includes my death. So I was about maybe 23 years old. It's a good time, I think, to really think about what you want to do. That got me into divinity school in Naropa. When I learned about that school, I was reading about John Cage and how he used silence in his music, and how much I myself and people around me I noticed crave that kind of silence. And how do I bring that into my life? Because I feel like if we don't look at these problems, if I don't look at these problems, I'm not going to live my life in a way that feels true. So it's all very selfish, you see. It comes from my need to find resolution. And I realized if I do this job as a chaplain, when I saw the program, I was like, wow, you're learning about philosophy and you get to help people with your philosophy. And in this case, we call it theology, because theology is like philosophy that is being used, that is being actively practiced. And that made perfect sense to look at that. I think when you study business, you learn a lot about how our system works and how much, what is a good word? It's not going to solve our problems. It's very practical in getting things done and getting money moved around, but it's not going to solve the bigger problems, which is how do we end the suffering that we all experience, and some greater than the others. So when I got into chaplaincy, I realized it is a lot like business. It's like business in the sense that it's about bringing something good to the public. And I think the heart of business is that. But because we have sort of, got a little confused along the way, there needs to be some integration. There needs to be integration of why we're doing things and how we're doing things. So in chaplaincy, I learned about how do I understand truth? How do I understand truth that everyone is carrying, right? Because it has to be interfaith. How do I bring my own truth and relate it with others so that we're meeting each other in the middle and not I'm trying to pull you to my bubble or you're trying to pull me and we're just fighting So how do we meet each other and really like start working together? In that, when you want to work with the community, you have to understand what community you're coming from and how to relate to that community first. And then how do I know who my people are? I have to understand what makes me who I am. And that means I have to understand my identities. And a lot of my identities are made up, right? It's sort of given to me. So how do I take that apart? And once I start taking that apart, so I'm an immigrant, I'm transgender, that means I have to be with people who share those identities so that we can carry our pain together. I think that's another important thing I learned in chaplaincy that is very valuable, is learning how to be compassionate, which is to suffer together, right? How do we suffer together and not alone? And how do I let others know that I'm with them in that suffering? So the more I learn about my identities, which takes a lot of unpacking and therapy, and also facing the hard truths, is that in some of these identities I have power. I have ability to access society in ways that others could not. If let's say I'm able-bodied, I can speak and think very functionally, and other people cannot. So how can I use that power to help others who need that? And also to help myself in the process. Because it has to start with myself first. I think the more I understand the different edges of my identities, the more I can connect better with the community, and the more I can provide spiritual care that is conscious of that, because I know that if I can be conscious of how I'm connected to others, that means I can tell and show others that what we're going through is connected. What a lot of people right now, I'm going to say, especially the Black, the trans women, and the disabled, what they're going through is connected to what I'm going through, because we all think in some ways very similarly. So in that sense, I'm going to be busy for the rest of my life. There's a lot of work to do. And I'm trying right now. I did sort of leave the chaplain industry last summer because I realized if I can really understand how to provide service outside of that bubble, because there is a bubble in the chaplain structure, the structure of chaplaincy, that does exclude a lot of experiences. So if I could really explore different ways to provide spiritual care that would hold me accountable, because it's easy to, this is not something that I can say in 8 minutes, but I'm just saying that there's a reason to what I'm doing, which is right now understanding how to do coalition work, how to organize with my community, and how to bring what I have learned about resiliency, how to bring the ways of building that capacity to hold my own pain and other people's pain, and then more and more and more, because our hearts don't really have boundaries, right? The older we get, I can say I'm 30 years old, so I know enough that there's a boundless capacity. So how do I keep expanding that and help others expand that? Because what else is there to do nowadays? Aside from feeling despair about what's going on out there, how do we find hope? And how do we find reason to keep going? How much time left? Did I pass time?
That's great.
Okay. I can keep going.
We'll come back.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you both for the work that you're doing. It's just such a privilege to sit up here with you two. Like Bruce said, I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and a few months after Ferguson happened, a group of clergy in town got together and said, we need to get to know the leadership of the police department. And because we didn't have a group that was regularly meeting with the department. And so a pretty diverse, for Fort Collins, group of clergy. I mean, it really was the most diverse group of clergy you could pull together in town. Started meeting regularly with the police department and to talk about some use of force issues. And there was a couple-year stretch in town where the department, some things happened that were cause for concern within the community, not just the religious community, but the broader community, and especially in our minority communities in town. And so about every 6 weeks, some version of our clergy group would meet with the police chief and other leaders of the department, and we would sometimes yell at each other and would disagree. Sometimes we would agree. They let us in to some degree, to their credit, and they kept coming back to the table. And so this went on for a few years, and some trust, I think, began to be built. And then there was a change in leadership, as happens in a lot of organizations within the Fort Collins department. And we had about a year where there was just a period of transition and kind of had to start over doing some work. But all along, some real effort on both sides, I think, to build trust and to deepen relationship. And I've learned, especially working with the police, that without some element of trust, that system, which is so resistant to change, it just will not change. And so a year ago, one of the members of the executive leadership team of the department called me up and said, Joseph, I need to meet you for coffee. And I immediately thought, oh no, what did we write? What am I going to get yelled at? And we met at a coffee shop, and this person, who was is an assistant chief of police, said, we realized something. As a department, we do a really good job. They use the analogy of a three-legged stool. They said we do a really good job with physical training. We do a really good job with mental and even some emotional training. But he said, we have not done a good job on the spiritual side of things. And he looked at me and said, would you be willing to help us start a chaplaincy program for the department? And I'm not joking. He said it, and I immediately looked behind me as if to say, are you talking to me? Because we've yelled at each other in meetings, and we disagree on some pretty fundamental things. And he said, we think that our department needs this. Officers have told us that we need to do some work on the spiritual side of things. And so that was a year ago. And that started what has been a 12-month journey in drafting policies. And I was very emphatic that if I was going to help do this, I got to at least have a pretty strong hand in picking who got to be asked the first go-around. Because for the reasons that my two colleagues up here have said, this was not going to be a Christian chaplaincy program. We had lunch earlier before this, and we were kind of talking about the idea that we all bring ourselves and who we are into the room with us. Like, as much as sometimes I don't want to be a Presbyterian minister, I can't go into a room and not be a Presbyterian minister. That doesn't need to be front and center always, and oftentimes, especially on airplanes, it is not. It is always a great moral conundrum when I'm asked on an airplane, what do you do?
Oh, you never want to.
I'm like, and I lie sometimes, I'll be honest. Talk about the intersection of the sacred. You just can't escape on an airplane. So anyway, I was very clear to the department that if we were going to do this, it was not going to be a Christian endeavor. And so far, it hasn't been. And we have sort of recruited as broad a base of chaplains as you can in Fort Collins. I actually think we can stand up to just about any police chaplaincy corps around the country. And so it's just 2 months ago it was sort of officially approved, and chaplains are going through background checks and all that. But in the meantime, we have been invited for the last year to go on ride-alongs. And, you know, there's an interesting, police work is, you might have read this, officers will say it, it's sort of like being a pilot. It's like 99% boring and 1% just sheer chaos. And it's interesting, when I went through CPE during seminary, I was assigned to the trauma ICU in a big county hospital in Austin. And when you're the chaplain in the trauma ICU, no one's in the trauma ICU for a good reason, right?
It's always bad.
And so it has been really interesting as a police chaplain to show up in a police car at 8 in the morning and nothing bad is going on, right? More often than not, I get to sit with an officer for 3 or 4 hours and we drive around town, and there are moments that inside of a police car, it becomes like a holy of holies. And I have learned, and I think one of the reasons that I said yes, and many of my colleagues have said yes to this work, is we ask the police to do impossible work. I got into this because I thought police systems need to change. And I think there are accountability challenges, so I am not up here sort of defending the police at all costs. And many officers will admit that the system needs to change. But the system, in large part, is because we have made it that way. Because we ask them to be social workers, and homeless advocates, and security guards, and marriage counselors, and referees. And then we give them machine guns. And no one person can do all of that. It does damage to people's souls. And so I have actually, this is still a growing edge for me, have developed a real sense of compassion for the men and women of the police department. And that's not to say that there aren't really, really important conversations that we need to have. But the struggles that we see in a lot of places in policing are an indictment on all of us. And everyone in this room, I mean, I know many of you, like, you want the systems to be different. So when I say us, I mean just us as a society. When all these other social systems fail and we rely on the police to do all of it, well, this is what we get. And so I think chaplains are in a really unique position to earn trust, to hold trust. We are the one person in the department that I cannot be compelled to testify. And so I hear things. And we are mandatory reporters, so certainly there are laws that go around it. But generally speaking, the chief of police cannot call me into his office and say, what did Officer Jones, I'm making up that name, what did Officer Jones tell you? Like, he just can't. And I'm sure you two see this as well. That is a gift that, it's just a gift to the people inside a police car. So there's certainly maybe more to be said, but that's how I got into that work and a little bit of what's happening at this point. I don't know if that was 8 minutes or not, but.
Yeah, where's the?
There you go. I know, we need a little timer.
Totally arbitrary. I'm here time. Well, what responses do you have to each other? Thoughts, or what have the contributions thus far prompted in each of you? Thoughts, reflections, more stories? I want to hear about Martin of Tours sometime, but there's a story.
I had a big reaction to both of you, which I'm so excited about. And
That's such a chaplain thing to say.
wasn't it? Chaplaining the chaplain. I think there's extra credit today. The first thing I loved was when Atlas talked about doing her own work. And people like Henry Nouwen have written about the wounded healer. And sometimes people think, oh, so it's okay if I bleed all over you while you tell me your story because I got that same wound. That's not what a wounded healer really is. But it's someone who has been able to pay attention to their own suffering and get the help they need from the community. Like you said, everyone should go to therapy, which I also believe. And so that you are able, as best you can, to care for that wound that you have and not inflict it on someone else. Now, there's times when that's not possible. So when my husband Jim was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, it seemed like the next 10 patients I had in the hospital just got diagnosed with multiple myeloma. How could that be? And I would have to say to my colleagues, I'm not going to be any good here because my wound is like bleeding all over the chair. So I'm going to leave that consult for you. Is that okay? So we kind of have to cover for each other. And so no one chaplain can do it all. And then the thing I love that you said, or you implied was, and I think it's the secret sauce in your story, is that before anything happened, before the conversation where they did this big invitation, you chaplained them. You acted out and lived what it was you were trying to talk about. And so that is so compelling that they felt strongly enough about what you did over that year, I think you said, or a couple of years, that's how the program was born, because you were the chaplain. That's such a cool story.
I just want to say that there was a whole bunch of other clergy people, some of whom are in this room, who were part of that. Like that was not, I just sent the emails out.
I have a feeling it was more than that.
I was the chair of the deal, but it really was an administrative.
A group thing.
Yeah. I'm curious, I'd love to hear more about resiliency. Both, as a minister, just as a parent, as a spouse. And I'm curious, sort of, if you have more thoughts about that. And also, Maria, just in your long time as a chaplain, what does that look like in your own practice?
Very messy. Go ahead.
I think very messy is a good start. I think about resiliency as like learning to be unstoppable, right? How do we learn that, how do I learn that it's a marathon and not a sprint? That if something is bothering me or hurting me right now, that there aren't more to come, but also there might be more joy that will come with that. And trying to remember, so the heart of Buddhist practice as a person who follows Buddhist teaching is understanding that everything is always changing. I think that's the gist of it. Got some nods from my classmate, Jody. Remembering that everything is always changing, and that means that whatever I'm experiencing can be viewed in so many different ways. And how do I get meaning out of that? How do I develop a meaning that serves me and others? So really, like, looking at what is the story that I'm crafting, that others are crafting around me, and how can we change that story? I think fiction is always, and poetry has been life-saving in that sense, to remember that, there's a way to imagine a world that's better than this, and how to keep being in touch with that. And remembering that even though we fall, we can still get up. And sometimes we may fall for a lifetime, and that's okay. Because, there are ways to look at this thing we call life and how to work with that. So anyway, I'm going to stop there.
I love this story idea because, and thanks to many people in this room, I've become acutely aware of how I am a graduate of MSU, which is making shit up, because I'll tell stories. A recent study at MSU showed, and I have a friend right now where he'll actually look at me and say, did you just make that up or is that real? And what is real? But we could talk all night about that. But I make up stories about other people and their circumstances and how they got there. And a small example in the emergency or in the ICU is, here he is again, you know, frequent flyer. I'm sure you hear frequent flyer in your work. And drunk again and passed out and seizures and, you know, draw straws. Who's going to take care of him today? And even sometimes if I can just say out loud without getting into my very huge judgmental soapbox, I wonder what his backstory is. And sometimes that's all it takes all of us to say, huh, well, I wonder. I mean, he didn't just get here from, you know, nowhere. So, and then I make up stories about myself. And I was telling Jim Reed about how I had a setback in a recent medical problem. I was going really well in my healing, and then I had a setback, and I made up a bunch of stories about how everything was going to go to hell in a handbasket now. And I remembered a prayer that Jim Reed gave me that took me out of making up a story. And the prayer starts, I don't know how, but, and then you say your intention. Because the how is how I was making up stories. So I love that you said that, and to me that points to resilience. When I'm not making up stories and can be what is. And I also have a mantra project that I've talked to a lot of you about. And one of my favorite mantras was a birthday gift, actually, from Jim. Everything keeps working out for me. And to be able to baldly say that in the midst of acute suffering and loss and grief, my own, isn't a lie. It's not a fake pretend. There's a deeper everything is working out.
In your experiences, what do people most often misunderstand about chaplains?
Weddings and funerals.
That they perform weddings and funerals?
Yeah. Or like a rent the priest.
Can you do my wedding?
No, only funerals.
So it's interesting working with the police, especially coming out of the kind of left main line. There are assumptions that are made when I'm in a police car. And it's not true for all officers, certainly. I mean, there's 200 plus officers in Fort Collins. They're not all the same. But there are plenty of times that an officer will speak to me about things, and I don't ever open the political door. Even generally, I don't open a sort of social systems door. If they open the door, like, we'll go where they need to go. But sometimes it's hard to go on that journey because there is an assumption that I feel a certain way about whatever issue they might be talking about.
Assume.
And it's, you know, it's tricky because sometimes the moment is right to say, you know, I feel differently about that. But oftentimes that moment is not for me to decide. I bring all that I am into the room or into the police car with me, but I don't need to paint that whole picture. And so for me, in that particular work, that's a fairly regular assumption that I come from a more conservative evangelical place. And that, you know, in that moment when they're talking to me about, you know, their family situation or some terrible thing that happened out on a call the week before, you know, they might need to make that assumption. And I don't need to change that assumption. Yeah. I don't know if that answers you.
I can relate to that so much because in the hospital and at hospice, there are a lot of assumptions. And I love how you said we bring our whole selves. And then I also feel like kind of being a spiritual surgeon, I'm not going to use every medication and every tool in the toolkit for your situation. And Tylenol doesn't work for everyone, you know, and so it's very specific. And so everybody wants to know, what religion are you? Because it helps them to get a grab bar to know who they're talking to. So it always depends on the situation where we go with that question, right? So this one time at the hospice care center, the nurse said, oh, this family's just dying for you to get in there, haha, you know, because the woman was dying. So I went in, it was a young woman, she was dying. She came from a very, very specific sect of Christianity. She said, oh, you're the chaplain, thank you for coming. And I said, it's my pleasure, I'm so happy to meet you. She said, what religion are you? So I knew I was auditioning, right? And I knew there was going to be a wrong answer, and it was probably going to be me. So I said, well, I'm a non-denominational chaplain, thinking I could skate. She goes, what church do you go to? She was going to drill all the way down. And I thought, okay, I want to be able to help her get what she needs. Skating isn't going to help her. And I said, I'm Catholic. She said, get out of my room. And the nurses were appalled, and they said, oh, poor you, you know, you got so disrespected because of your faith. And I said, hold your horses. Unfortunately, in my tradition, we have not respected everyone else throughout all of human history. Small payback. No problem. No problem. And then I happened to know the hospital pastor for her church, who's a good friend of mine. I called her up. I said, Becky, I need you now. She said, I'm on my way. So I was able to get her what she needed. It just wasn't going to be me. So sometimes I feel like we're just a Rorschach test and people project onto us exactly what they need. I somehow associate this with you, Meg, when you were shadowing and someone said, are you a lady chaplain? And I thought, I like that. I'm going to get some gloves and some brown. Pretty much whatever works for you is what I'm going to be. And Kim, I know exactly what you're... Kim has 100 stories.
I feel that at working at the university as a spiritual care provider, and this is a CSU, right? It's not a liberal arts or a private university. So there's a lot of opinions and feelings about religion and the separation of church and state and all the things involved in that. So yeah, coming in as like, hi, I'm your spiritual care provider, and having the people like, and even though I, in my mother's word, look like this, like I don't look Christian, I still get assumed that because there is a trauma that is pretty deep that comes from Christianity, and a lot of the people are very sensitive around spirituality. So the whole year I had to do basically a course on what is spirituality, and I used your definition. That's, I think, a really good one. And to talk about the importance of us being more connected with what we're studying, what we're doing, and with ourselves. Yeah.
It's pretty problematic because chaplain is a Christian word. It means the clergyman who cares for the chapel. And chapel is a Christian word for a holy sanctuary. So we're stuck with the word. You know, if you say I'm your spiritual caregiver, that flies in a lot of places. Other people are like, so what? We're doing yoga? Or, yeah, they don't know.
You've done yoga in IC.
We've done it all. So I don't know, maybe we could come up with a new word as a part of this series.
I like existentialist. So we're going through.
Well, thank you all. And so let's just push the pause button now for 5 or 6 minutes. Invite you to find some refreshment, find the restrooms if you need, and then come back, because that will be your time to ask questions and be in dialogue with them. So see you in a few minutes.
Needed, I think, but I'm going to give it to you. I'm sitting next to our couch waiting for us.
I am so thankful to the three of you for being here. So thank you, thank you, thank you. My question has to do with secondary stress. So kind of my understanding of secondary stress is, you know, I didn't go through the hurricane, but I've seen pictures and I've heard stories, and I have a reaction because of that. And you guys work with that all the time, and I do too in a different way. And so I'm wondering, how do you handle secondary stress?
I mean, I think both of you said everyone needs a therapist. Like, one of you said therapy saved your life. I think I would say that too. It certainly has saved my relationships. I'm married to an ER doctor, so we get it kind of like from all fronts. And yeah, I mean, I don't mean that as an oversimplification, but I need a therapist. My therapist is like my pastor, which in my tradition is what I need.
Or at least someone to help you carry the weight, because it's not for your own to carry. It's a systemic issue, right? The weather, the climate, all these things. And knowing where my part ends and others begin. And knowing at the end of the day, you know, I did my best, and that's all I can worry about. Because otherwise I'm just going to tire myself out. And in the long run, so learning how to rest, how to really rest as a form of, as a healing practice. It's really hard to let go. I was bedridden for a month in July, and I had a crisis because we're so used to be trained to keep working, be productive. So learning how to just like say, I don't care right now. You know.
Atlas, what have you learned about how to really rest?
Learning to engage with my senses and really like pay attention to how I'm engaged. Like the food I'm eating at lunch, am I really tasting it? Or am I somewhere else? The weather is so nice outside, am I really feeling it? Or am I just thinking, oh, it's a nice weather and moving on? So really be present. Yeah.
Thank you.
I like that. We should have had a support group for chaplains who aren't working, because I haven't worked since the middle of July because of an injury. But walking the other day, I said to my companion, I don't think I've ever experienced the clouds the way I have this summer since I've been off work. And he said, I think you've always looked, but I don't know if you've really seen. So, the big thing now, and I know your work, is moral distress, and there's a lot of conversation. I know last winter, Carrie Doring from ILIF gave a really nice presentation about moral distress. We also deal with vicarious trauma and cumulative grief. And so having companions, for me, other chaplains, even if I don't do a case review, when I look at Kim and she nods at me, it's like, okay, we're okay. To know there are grab bars, and to have other professionals where it's safe to hold the stories together, and having a spiritual practice, whatever yours is. And I've become a better black belt boundary person. I was kind of boundaryless in my first years at hospice. I'd work all day, all night, any day, any time. And now I really do have an on-off switch and just a simple practice to mention one. You can make up your own. But my mom taught me this actually. Every time I clean my hands, which in the hospital it's something like 75 or 80 times a day, I do a little prayer of let go. And when I'm coming into a space and I'm cleaning my hands, my little gatha or prayer is, show me what's mine to do. Because I'd like to do everything, so just show me what's mine.
My name's Lindsay. I'm not a chaplain. I don't need that. Thank you. You don't need that. I'm not a chaplain. I'm here because I was curious. And I have to say I'm very appreciative. Back in 2013 when I had a very severe car accident, you know, chaplains came in. I'm a Buddhist and I've had a lot of surgeries. And this past surgery I had 7 weeks ago, for the first time in all my surgeries, a Buddhist chaplain came in. And my friend Kimberly was there, so she was doing her little Christian chaplaincy thing.
Like,
You know, as my friend and as a chaplain. And then the Buddhist chaplain and I were each praying in Buddhist, you know, saying each saying our own prayer. And it was probably one of the most profound experiences I had before one of my surgeries. And I was just so grateful that someone who didn't know me came in and took the time to pray with me, to meditate with me, and to ask the universe and the divine spirit to be with me and to be in that surgery room and with the surgeon's hands and all their little helpers. So I am truly grateful for your service. Thank you so much.
thank you. You know, we are really in northern Colorado, as we all know, at kind of a rough spot with chaplains who are all kind of look alike. I'm glad to have Atlas on the team because a lot of us are getting older. And so on our staff, we have really tried at Poudre Valley Hospital. I feel so proud that we have a Jew, we have a Buddhist, we've got a Unitarian Universalist, and they're everything, so that counts. But it's hard because, and now, finally, more people are coming through the training programs that can bring us more diversity. So I'm glad you got a diverse moment.
Who's gonna?
Oh, I think there's someone with a microphone back there.
Yes.
Would you like my
I don't need that. I got a good voice. All right, how's that? That's better. All three of you work in institutions that are not about spirituality. They're about other things. And we, members of the public, from time to time, will come into contact with these institutions. And to us, it's like going to a different planet. We don't speak the language, we don't speak the local dialect, we don't understand often, particularly I think in the hospital, and if we come into contact with the police, we don't really understand what's going on. Many of us have been to college, although for some of us it's been a while, but at least many of us have had that experience. But I'd love to hear a little bit from each one of you about how would you advise members of the public to be prepared when they come into contact with the institution you work with to make the best use of your presence as a chaplain.
Really good question.
Stop. Okay.
So, I mean, I was just a patient at the hospital and for 4 days. And it's so ironic that they call you a patient when you're in the hospital, because you are not patient. You are so eager for that next test result, that next doctor visit, that next therapy. Can I order my lunch? Everything, it's set up for impatience. And I think we should just change it right now, that when you go to the hospital, you're an impatient. And
Well, they come close, they call it an inpatient.
Inpatient.
Which is not quite the same thing.
But I think the sweetest thing is when people even ask. A lot of times my referrals come from doctors and nurses who say, oh my God, this gal, she just got really bad news. Can you go in there? Like we're gonna, solve it or fix it. But more and more now, people are asking, like, where did she go with the surgery? Just had the surgery and asked for a chaplain. So I think that that's a sweet time when you're in the midst of suffering to have someone who has no agenda, doesn't have a clipboard they have to fill out, doesn't have tools and medicines and procedures, just has their body, mind, spirit for you. So go ahead and ask.
Yeah, being prepared to be in a space that's not really familiar. I think most of the time people come in, they're like, is this like therapy or is this like advising? Like I'm not sure what I'm supposed to get. And just being able to be with who you are, because my job is to witness your experiences and to help you explore your territory, right, your inner world, and point out, oh, that's interesting, let's look at that today. And so being prepared to be with that, because I can't be with you if you can't be with that. Yeah.
So police chaplaincies come in different forms. Some are more oriented to be sort of community chaplains, but others are designed more to be chaplains to a particular department. And in this case, for the development of this program, at this point it is more internally focused. I mean, my advice, like we interact with the police usually only on our bad days, right? Either because we're a victim or we've committed a crime. It's rare that we just interact with the police. And this is a problem in this country. And so my first piece of advice would be, like, when you're at New West Fest and there's like 800 police, just stop and say hi. And remember, like, you are dealing with an institution, but institutions are made up of discrete people. And these are people who have families. These are people, at least in our department, who are highly educated. I mean, they're all college graduates. Many of them have done unique things before they came to work for the department. And most of them, not all, but most of them are really personable people and would love to talk to you, not in a crisis. And so, I mean, there's a huge movement in clergy circles talking about protecting houses of worship. And the first piece of advice that the FBI gives to leaders of faith communities who are going through these trainings is get to know the commander of your particular area of town in the police department. They said, if you don't do anything else, get to know your police officer who's in charge. And I would say the same thing for all of us. If you want to interact with the police, like, say hi to them when you haven't been in a car wreck, or, I mean, in this town, mercifully, we don't have a lot of violent crime, but when you're not a victim, or I know some of you, a perpetrator. But in our particular case, for the chaplains, I was on a ride-along once, and an officer said, you know, if you want to wear your clergy gear, you can, if you want to interact with people, there's a domestic violence call that we were going to, and I'm thinking, no, like, I didn't go to the police academy. Like, domestic violence calls are like some of the most dangerous calls. Like, I don't like danger. And I'm not going to walk up behind a police officer with my little clergy collar on. And so, in our case, it's a little bit different interaction. But I still would say, get to know those men and women. That's great.
Do we have one up front here?
Yeah, before, oh yes.
I just wondered if there is any connection with the Stephen ministry. Do they ever call youth chaplains in to do part of the Stephen ministry?
So do you want to say something about what Stephen ministry is?
Well, I don't know very much about it, except for, again, it's I think it doesn't necessarily relate to any particular religion or any particular, but it is apparently growing, and there's a need for Stephen ministry, for helping others, and it seems like there's a relationship with what you're doing.
So Stephen's ministers come out of faith communities, and lay people are trained to go to people typically in their house of worship and sit with them, whether it's for grief, illness, accident, whatever the topic might be. And so I have done a lot of training for Stephen's ministers groups on how to be a story catcher and how to accompany people in their story. And I have had Stephen's ministers reach out to me and say, you know, a member of our church is there. And then I've had patients say, we have a Stephen's ministry at my church. And I'm thinking, I'm a one-shot wonder. I'm only going to see you in the hospital for a minute, then you're going to go home and have the rest of your life. How awesome to call your house of worship and say, I've been asked by so-and-so that you would be in touch with them because they're going to need some long-term spiritual support. So I love it when that happens. And I often, if someone identifies as a member of a faith community, I will often say, do they know you're here? Do they know what's happening? And some people say, I don't want them to know. And some people say, can you call my pastor right now? And some people say, oh yeah, we called the pastor, you know, while the ambulance was coming. So people are at all different places in their relationship with their spiritual community.
Thank you.
So, Joseph, when I came here because I read your blurb that you wrote, I guess it was like a preview, a couple months ago in the World Wisdom's email. And so you talked about police chaplaincy, and I didn't know what that was, and I got really excited because I thought it was what you were just saying you don't want to do.
Yes.
And I feel like we live in a community where you open the newspaper, first page is the person that got arrested for molesting his daughter or beating his wife or, you know, stealing. And I just feel like our society, we're just so full of judgment. And how amazing. I was imagining you, police chaplain, going on these calls and like being a human being that sees someone doing something horrific and saying, you know, for the first time in their life, this is a person actually like listening to them. And maybe the point is, in a violent moment, that's not the time. But I would love to hear about, are there models for that, police chaplaincy, where we're dealing with the perpetrators who, you know, they're being treated like animals, and so they've never known any differently, and like how to access their humanity for themselves, you know?
Yeah.
As a part of stopping crime.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I don't know of any departments in the country, and by no means am I an expert in police chaplaincy, although I feel like I'm familiar with a number of different models. I don't know of any models where a chaplain would be invited to be a participant with an officer in an active call.
Right.
Primarily because the officers, again, for all of the reasonable criticism, speaking just for this department, are highly trained, and are highly trained with one another, not with a 41-year-old seminary graduate wearing a clergy collar. Like that adds, even on a ride-along, it adds a dynamic, to some degree of danger for the officer that I'm even there. Because they're not just thinking now about the interaction they're having, they're also thinking about, I don't want the chaplain to die. Right? So I recognize that I am increasing to some degree the risk in a situation. So I don't know of any models where a chaplain would be invited with a highly, highly inflamed situation to say, hey, let's talk about this. Now, I think one maybe hybrid model, and we're doing it here, we're doing it in Loveland, there's places around the country that are doing it, where there are many situations that officers don't really need to go to. But they do go because, like what I said in the beginning, we've sort of had this failure as a community, and so, well, we're just going to send the police. Well, really what we need is a highly trained mental health worker who can go, and I would argue that in that moment, they are the chaplain.
Yeah.
Because they are not treating that situation, because for the police, it's, you follow my orders, or I escalate until you follow my orders.
Yeah.
And that's starting to change, and I think it's actually starting to change in this department with police leadership, saying, you know what, sometimes we show up somewhere and we need to leave. Like, that is almost unheard of.
That's really cool.
Because policing is set up to where I tell you what to do, if you don't do it, I have this sort of matrix I can go through until you do what I said to do. With the mental health, the crisis mental health workers that we have now in this county, they get to go into a situation where they don't have a gun, they don't have a nightstick, they don't get to elevate it because there's nothing to elevate it to, which I think chaplains at our best, we can go into a situation and if we do what we're trained to do, the temperature in the room can go down. So that's maybe an excuse to say, well, other people are doing that work, but that's the closest model I can.
Yeah, no, it's helpful to hear.
Yeah.
Well, and I think I had a conversation with the fire chief in Loveland once, who was, his family member was a patient of mine, and I think it comes from within the organization. And he said to me, oh, I bet you've seen it all here in the emergency department, because we do. And I said, yes. And I said, I bet you've seen it all. And I said, how do your staff respond? Because you're getting hit and thrown, people are throwing things at you and they're inebriated or high or they're not in their right mind. And how do your officers or your fire personnel manage all that? And he told me this, and I've never forgotten it, and I've taught it to nurses as a model, and of course chaplains. He said, here's what I teach my staff. You will call everyone ma'am or sir. You will put the respect on, even if it doesn't feel like you want to. Number two, if it's hard for you to connect with someone who is having a really, really difficult time in front of you or at you, you will say to yourself, and it doesn't save the day every time, but you will say to yourself, that's my mom, that's my dad, that's my brother, that's my sister, that's my son, that's my daughter. So he went into big mind, right? Of we are all connected in our suffering, which is a theme that you brought us to today. And I kind of feel that way about my chaplaincy too. My brother has died, and in spite of a lot of people's best efforts, he died at his own hand. So I can't take care of him anymore, but I can take care of your brother when he comes into the emergency room, having tried to take his own life. Or I can take care of your sister, and they can become mine. So that's the kind of stuff that can grow inside of an organization.
My name is Mark, and I appreciate just your perspective, your insights in this spiritual journey in chaplaincy. And so my question is, before I get to my question, also I like the way that you posture yourself in showing unconditional love in a way that makes people feel that they're not alone. And so whether they believe in the Creator or God or whoever, is that God is with them and in their presence. And so, so in this, because we're talking about spiritual journeys, I guess I'm most interested in, so what do you perceive as spiritual warfare that you feel that in doing your job, you're experiencing or you're being impacted by spiritual warfare? What does that look like for you, and how do you deal with that? Like, for example, Ephesians talks about, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, rulers of this world, darkness, spiritual wickedness high. If that's part of your perspective as Judeo-Christian posture that you might take, how do you deal with that in the position of chaplaincy?
Go ahead.
I feel like the warfare I experience is constantly between finding enough space to practice and deepen my path, and then to engage with the world that feels so exhausting most of the time. Because it does take a lot of work, right? To deal with people who can't agree with you, people who can't see you for who you are. That is stressful, but at the same time, that is the practice. And it's so easy to want to go hide in the woods and just raise 10 dogs and, not talk to anyone. It's tempting, but the real work comes in engaging with others and dialoguing with others, which takes so much practice. I think about the best leaders have a spiritual practice that helps them survive those conversations. So that's where the idea of warfare comes, is like, can I work with the forces that seek out to destroy me and turn that around in a way that harnesses it into an energy that allows us to grow? Because everyone has good intentions, everyone's passionate about something, and can we work with that instead of returning punches after punches? Yeah. Thank you.
It's not it's not language that I find entirely helpful, but I'm saying that as someone who has never been homeless, never been addicted to drugs, I've never been abandoned in a way that I had nowhere to turn, and I, just as a pastor, have had people say, the demons are after me. And while that's not the language that resonates with me, I don't get to take that language from someone. And in their experience, yeah, they're right. Cocaine is a terrible demon for some people. I mean, we could get into kind of what I think is going on in that Ephesians text. I mean, I think empire, and I mean, there's a lot there. But I think for a lot of people, that's really meaningful language that I need to honor. Yeah.
Well, I wanted him to talk first, and I wanted Atlas to talk. So our chaplains at Poudre Valley Hospital also go to Mountain Crest by referral. And we have a lot of visits over there, and there often is an intersection in people who are struggling with a mental illness, as well as how their spiritual beliefs have informed or dialogued with that mental illness, and also sometimes physical illness or disability at the same time. So if someone at Mountain Crest, I don't know, is my voice carrying over there? Yeah. Someone at Mountain Crest says the demons are after me and quotes that particular sacred scripture passage, because I'm going to go into your worldview, I'm going to say, tell me more, and what's most helpful, and what prayer do you cling to assist you when you feel that the demons are after you? That's Chaplain. And whether that's my worldview or not doesn't even matter. And I don't expect you to match up with my worldview, and I don't expect me to match up with your theological or worldview. We can still join our hearts. We can bind our hearts at the most profound level. And that's why it's so not helpful for people to say, what religion are you? Because it can become a barrier. And some of my sweetest, most intensely mutually beneficial chaplain relationships with patients, families, staff have been when, if we would have started with what's your belief system, what's your politics, what's your this, what's your that, we never could have even said, how do you do? But if we could meet at the heart level and have a dialogue that could be mutually enriching, and not necessarily that we all have to use the same language and I have to talk you into mine, then that's really where it's at. I had a family in the hospice care center that was there for a couple weeks years ago, and there was a very astute daughter of a patient. I think she was a psychologist or a psychiatrist or something. And she came up to me one day, and I don't want you to think that this means chaplains are fake, okay? She comes up to me one day, she goes, I figured out finally what you're doing here. Practice, you're a shapeshifter. You are able to, you're multilingual. You're able to enter into someone's experience, sometimes seamlessly, so that none of that even matters. So anyway, that was a really, I might have veered off.
Shapeshifted.
So y'all are talking a lot about being able to meet people where they are, whether that exists. Thank you, you really don't have to do whether that exists within or outside of, or whether you're aware of the conversation that exists between your and their identities. You all work in institutions. It is inherent to an institution that systems of oppression and privilege will exist alive and well in those institutions. And meeting people where they are, I feel like is often filtered through these systems of oppression and privilege that are so inherent to these institutions in a way that maybe makes it impossible to meet them fully in their identities. I'm wondering, what does your faith teach you about systems of privilege and oppression? And also, what do you do when you're not equipped to meet someone in their identities?
We have 5 minutes to journal. Okay, let me make sure I got the question right. So it's about, I think there's multiple questions.
2 questions.
There's 2 questions. So one of them is, how do you work in the system? For me, university, that's very predominantly white. We have a lot of incidents last week, and we'll have more. Trump Jr. is coming, so. And function in that setting?
Yeah, and like, what does your faith provide to be able to work with those systems?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, with Buddhism, we start with the hard truth, right? There's this suffering and it's not going away. So what's the difference where I am dealing with it? Because I could work in the retreat center and tend to vegetables. That sounds great. But working in an institution like CSU holds me accountable and makes sure that I don't forget what is happening. And when I can't meet people where they're at, I do my best. I do my best, and I also have my own stuff. I'm also very young, and I still have a lot of learning to do, so I forgive myself. And I know that, like, just the effort of trying shows, and that's all you can do sometimes, and it is supposed to be messy. I think growth and healing is not clean as much as we'd like it to be. So there will be times when I'm working with a student of different identity where it comes off offensive and comes off like I'm saying all the wrong things. And I think that should be okay. We did start a campaign called Rams Fell Forward, and the intention is for us to fail more and be okay with failing and show each other that we are trying. We're not trying to be perfect, but we're trying.
I mean, is there anything else we have to say? I think my main thing is I am not equipped to be able to meet every single human in their particular gorgeous layered story of all their history and their identities and their... So I call in other people, and I will even say to someone, I am so glad that I've met you today. Thank you for calling on me. I have someone who would even be better to be able to come and sit with you, may I call on them? And so I have no illusion that I can do it all. Number two, we as chaplains have a unique, as Joseph has illustrated, a unique position to call our institutions. It only happened in the last few years that my institution started asking people their gender identity. I mean, before you didn't have much choice, you know, you had to be one thing or another, and you didn't have an opportunity to say, here's how I would like to be identified. So institutions, as we know, move slowly, but we have a unique place where we can call the institution. And I think finally, keeping myself as honest as I can, I just went to a seminar on young teens and preteens getting ready to transition gender, the emotional, psychological, physical processes through a clinic in Denver. They presented. I was like, sign me up. I don't know anything about preteens getting ready to do gender transition. So we have to keep ourselves accountable for where are my blind spots and make myself available to all kinds of education and reading and learning and meeting new people, because we're never going to be done. And I think in my tradition, basically Jesus said everybody belongs, and the more layers and textures you have, as my therapist likes to say, in other words, the more your story is a little different, the more welcome you are. So that's, you know, I like listening to that.
I don't have anything articulate to add to what they said. I mean, I'm a white, straight male who works with the police department. I mean, and so I think for me, it's like just recognizing that, and hopefully approaching life and experience with enough humility to admit, like I will fail as much as I won't. That there's so much I have to learn from, I mean, even just today. And so I hope that for someone like me, maybe humility is the best we can do. And Jesus talked a lot about that. And we stole, like Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor. Like if we could just do that. That's a gross oversimplification, but you two said it so well.
Okay.
I just wanted to offer something relative to this issue of the perps, as they're called on the TV. I'm a chaplain wannabe. I'm going to be a chaplain hopefully next March. And I'm in a unique program at the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, run by Roshi Joan Halifax. And her vision was that there should be chaplains in absolutely every aspect of human life. Because who doesn't need, I mean, even if you can't get dinner cooked, wouldn't it be great if your chaplain just showed up? Pat on the back. But one of the programs that's gaining some traction are protest chaplains, which I find very interesting. I'm not sure I will be called there, but because the conversation that goes on is you're not just there to serve the people on your side. You know, so it's a racist, it's a white supremacist rally, and there are both sides there. And who are we there to serve? And the obvious answer for most of us that would be really comfortable would be to serve those who are opposed to the rally. But what does it take to be able to come alongside someone with a substantially different view of the world than yours, and just be able to come alongside? And so I think it's a great question. I think there's more happening about how do we do that, and what does it take in practice to do that.
Any response from the panel?
Well, in my paper for my grad school, I wrote about how Ayn Rand got me into Buddhism. So I feel very well equipped to face this question because we all want something good for the world, and some of us see things very differently. And as someone who is in the middle of this all, like, I don't disagree with anyone, but I do disagree with how the way we do things. How do I navigate that? One step at a time, right? If I can talk to someone who's a fascist or conservative or whatever that is intense nowadays, for 10 minutes, that's good enough for me. But it's not my job to hold all the weight in the world. I hold what I can hold, and I hold what is bearable for me. Yeah.
I don't remember very much from seminary, but I remember the day I learned the definition of companion, and it comes from the Latin to eat with. It's actually with bread. And the idea that sort of at our best, we're companions with one another. But I can only sit at a table and wait, right? So in that scenario you set up with the protesters and the white supremacists, I love the idea of being a companion with those people flying a Confederate flag. But I only have so much agency in that. And so I need to constantly be aware of my desire and openness and need to be, like, we need to be companions with one another, otherwise the whole thing is going to blow up. So I can even set the table, but I can't make someone be the companion. And I need to be okay with that. And that's really hard. Both sides, wanting to have a chair. Like, I had breakfast with Karl Rove once. It's a totally different story. And in some ways it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. But in other ways it was amazing. Because, like, Karl Rove eats. And I had forgotten that. And then in some ways it humanized Karl Rove for me. So, yeah, I love what you're saying. We have to be careful I can't beat myself up if the table's set and it's just me that day.
One thing someone in our cohort said when we were talking about this was, well, could we offer them cookies? It reminded me, it's like, well.
I think what Atlas also brought is working with our own suffering. And I can talk about this now because my daughter has been doing some public speaking about this. But we had a situation in our family where my daughter was molested, and there ended up being a civil lawsuit and a criminal lawsuit. And I remember the day that my husband Jim and I decided that at his sentencing, that we were going to stand up and ask that he be sentenced to community corrections rather than treated as an adult and go to Canyon City. Because my husband was in probation. He wasn't in probation. He was a probation officer. That would have been really weird. And he knew what would happen to this young man if he went to that prison. That there would be nothing therapeutic about it. In fact, he would be brutalized. So I remember the day that Jim and I stood up in the courtroom and asked for that sentence, that we wanted education, and we wanted therapy, and we wanted it in the community, where he was going to end up living eventually. And I remember the shock and awe of Judge Sullivan, if you happen to remember him. And he became so uncomfortable that we wanted to companion this kid. And he said, if it weren't for the fact that it's Jim Cox who works in the system and knows of that which he speaks, I would never allow it, but I will allow it. And it ended up, not working out for this kid. He ended up needing to go ahead and go into the big prison system. But we knew we had at least attempted to companion. It's not always going to work. but there was an opportunity there for us to say, we want the best for you. And most people would have preferred us to say, go to hell and don't ever come out. And so if we can work with our own suffering around that, then when we get into a public setting, we have a better chance if we go to therapy.
Yeah, it all
That
comes
was
down-
5 years
yeah.
of therapy for that.
It comes down to how we hold others accountable and how we hold ourselves accountable as a community. And we tend to go towards punishment,
Yeah.
which doesn't work. So how do we call people in a way that, helps foster growth?
We could go on. This is just the beginning of a conversation, I think, on use one topics. Linda.
We have one more question, can we ask?
Oh,
Maybe this will just wrap it up nicely, I don't know, and if it doesn't.
I bet it will.
I bet it will too.
Jill around it.
Yeah. I've had experiences, I'm a CSU alum, so there's my CSU connection. I was a victims advocate for the Fort Collins Police Department, and Maria has been in my life for 30-some years. And she also was our chaplain when our father died of cancer. So what I want from you all, the three of you, is to set a challenge for those of us here in this audience on what we can do. I think when we come to presentations like this, we often go away, I think it's just natural human behavior, but we often go away and say, okay, these three have it taken care of and I don't have to do anything except put my donation in the box.
Wow.
So, if
Want
you
a
could-
list?
No, I don't want a list because I have a list big enough, long enough for myself, but if you could just charge us with one challenge, each of you, I would appreciate that.
For me, it's always about what do you do when you're suffering? What do you do when things are hard? That's reflective of how we deal with conflict outside. So how aware are we of our own inner systems and the way we perpetuate harm on ourselves and then on others because of that? And how do we undo that? And start being more aware every day, every moment. That's all. Easy. Yeah.
So we've used the acronym CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, which is sort of the formal training that chaplains undergo. You don't have to take CPE to speak the sacred into the secular. You don't actually have to speak to be a chaplain beyond saying, I'm here if you need me. And so I guess my challenge would be that we're lucky that we got to be invited up here to share our experiences. I imagine every person in this room could take a seat up here and tell just as interesting stories and share your experiences. And so don't think it's just us. You don't have to have taken CPE to say to someone, I'm here if you need me, and to mean it.
Well, I don't know why, Jill and I did not plan this, but I brought a prayer for you, and I have a bunch of copies of it. I don't know if there's enough for everyone, but I'll put them on the table. And I'm going to read it right now. So if you say this prayer, this is my one thing you can do. It's from the Dalai Lama. May I become, I'm going to say we, so I'll say it for the whole room. May we become at all times, both now and forever, a protector for those without protection, a guide for those who have lost their way, a ship for those with oceans to cross, a bridge for those with rivers to cross, a sanctuary for those in danger, a lamp for those without light, a place of refuge for those who lack shelter, and a servant to all in need.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. There are evaluation forms down at your feet. Our next program is November 14 at 6:30 p.m. at First United Methodist. We invite you to come to that. Thank you so much. Have a good day.